So I'm Amit Pal, the Communications Director of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And I'm extremely honored to introduce Michelle Goldberg. Michelle, actually, this is the second time she's honoring us with her presence. Back in 2006 in San Francisco, where coincidentally next year our convention will be held, we had invited her to speak. And we were way ahead of the curve. At that time, Michelle was an emerging writer. But this time we doubled down in inviting her to speak here. And in a manner of speaking, our bet was completely rewarded because just this week it was announced that she'll be a columnist for the New York Times. I mean, that's an incredible honor, but it was no coincidence. We weren't sort of making a blind bet even in 2006, and neither now, because Michelle actually has really distinguished herself. She has written for a variety of publications from Slate to Rolling Stone to Glamour, New Yorker, The Nation, and she's written two prescient, if I may use the word in this gathering, almost prophetic books, which are available for sale, and Michelle will be signing them in that corner of the room. They are Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, written back in the Bush era, and that's the subject that Michelle will be addressing in her talk, Donald Trump and Christian Nationalism. And The Means of Reproduction, Sex, Power, and the Future of the World, an incredible reporting sort of endeavor where Michelle has not only written about, but actually reported on global reproductive rights and policy globally. And her latest book, which is also very intriguing, and one I'd love to read. I read the first two for an interview I did with Michelle just earlier today. Her latest book is The Goddess Pose, The Audacious Life of Indra Devi, the woman who helped bring yoga to the West. And Michelle has, as I said, her work has appeared in a variety of publications. She has written a good number of books. She has taught at NYU's Graduate School of Journalism, lectured throughout the United States and Europe, and has been interviewed on many radio and TV shows. So we at FFRF are really pleased to welcome her and to give her a platform to speak about the current state of the United States and the rise of Christian nationalism, and also perhaps to get a sneak peek at what she'll be writing about for the New York Times. So welcome, Michelle. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And like Amit said, 11 years ago, I published a book called Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, which was about a kind of then ascendant, authoritarian, fundamentalist movement in American politics. And I'm going to start by quoting something I wrote in that book. I wrote, "America is full of good people, but something dark is loose. There's a free-floating anxiety that easily metastasizes into paranoia and hatred for the same enemies always targeted by authoritarian populist movements: homosexuals, urbanites, foreigners, intellectuals, and religious minorities. Rationality is losing its hold, empirical evidence is discounted as the product of a secular worldview or a scheming liberal elite. Democracy suffocates in this atmosphere, and space opens up for something else to supplant it." I think we're starting to see what that something else looks like. When I wrote that book, a lot of people said that it was overwrought or hysterical, and I was never entirely sure whether or not they were right? I mean, there's something about being a writer, you're sort of like, it's the Buddhist parable of the blind man and the elephant, right? You try to describe what's in front of you as best you can, but there's always something that you're missing. You try as best you can to give a picture of what you're observing and what the people that you're talking to are saying, but you can never be sure how representative the people that you're talking to are of a broader phenomenon. So I thought there was something really dark and frightening in the United States. I thought that democracy was maybe more fragile, or at least liberal secular democracy was more fragile than a lot of us hoped, but I wasn't entirely sure. And then Barack Obama was elected in 2008, and for a while it really seemed like Christian nationalism was in fact no longer on the rise. So one of the figures that I wrote about a lot in Kingdom Coming was Roy Moore. How many of you are familiar with him? So Roy Moore at the time had become a martyr to the Christian right. He had, as Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, he'd had this 2.6-ton granite Ten Commandments monument installed at the courthouse. A judge had said he'd have to remove it. He defied the judge and ended up being removed himself. And to a lot of people in the movement, he was a martyr to secular tyranny. When I was reporting the book, I saw school kids doing a modern dance about his heroism and mistreatment. He spoke to rallies of thousands and thousands of people. And this is, I think most of you do know who he is. For those who don't, maybe I'll give a taste of who he was. In 2002, he awarded custody of 3 children to their allegedly abusive father over their lesbian mother, saying that homosexuality was abhorrent, immoral, detestable, a crime against nature. And then he implied that gay people should perhaps be put to death. The state carries the power of the sword, that is, the power to prohibit conduct with physical penalties, such as confinement and even execution. It must use that power to prevent the subversion of children towards this lifestyle. So I thought it was chilling to see crowds cheering for more, to see children dancing for more. But at the same time, you know what? The system kind of worked as it was supposed to. He was removed. And I'm going to tell you the truth. I would have never, in my wildest dreams, have imagined 11 years ago that Roy Moore would soon be on the cusp of winning a U.S. Senate seat, which is where we are right now. He's currently leading in the polls for the Republican primary to take over Jeff Sessions' Senate seat. I also never would have imagined in my wildest nightmares that Jeff Sessions would be the Attorney General. Jeff Sessions, I think, probably best known among a lot of people for his very strident opposition to immigrants and to civil rights law. But it probably won't surprise a lot of you that he does not like secularists. He has decried the idea of a quote-unquote wall of separation between church and state. He says it's not constitutional and not historical. He attacked Justice Sonia Sotomayor for having a postmodern, relativistic, secular mindset that is directly contrary to the founding of the Republic. And during his confirmation hearing, he was directly asked by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse if a secular person could have just as good a claim to understanding the truth as someone who is religious. And Sessions hedged, and he said, "I'm not sure." And so he's not, as you well know, he's not the only enemy of secularism and proponent of what I then called Christian nationalism, this kind of Christian fundamentalism tied to a very authoritarian, almost quasi-fascist kind of nationalism. He's not the only exponent of that sort of ideology who's in the White House. There's Mike Pence, who once gave a speech saying that it was un-American or wrong to be teaching evolution because quote, every signer of the Declaration of Independence believed in creationism. In 2011, when the House voted to defund Planned Parenthood, which back then was still a radical idea. I mean, it's hard to remember now, but that's something that even George W. Bush, who I don't want to cast a golden glow over the administration of George W. Bush, however much it might look inviting in retrospect, but even George W. Bush would have never tried to defund Planned Parenthood because that was just too far out of the realm of kind of mainstream politics 11 years ago. And the person who put it kind of into the realm of mainstream politics, or really helped put it into the realm of mainstream politics, was Mike Pence. When the House voted to defund Planned Parenthood in 2011, the legislation was called the Pence Amendment. There is Ben Carson, who has, who has complained that, quote, secular progressives have succeeded in de facto redefining part of the Constitution. Betsy DeVos, who has talked about her work in privatizing public school funding as being a way to, quote, advance God's kingdom. There's Mike Pompeo, who's the head of the CIA. I watched some of when he was nominated, I watched some of his old rallies, including a 2015 God and Country rally in Kansas, where he talked about the values. We will, quote, "We will defend our Christian values and American exceptionalism with all our heart," he said. And then he said that battle is, quote, "a never-ending struggle," never-ending, that is, until the rapture. There has been stories pretty recently in the news about Mike Pompeo Christianizing the CIA, trying to recruit more white conservative Christians, trying to make Bible study more a part of the culture of the CIA. And so you do see this sort of slow Christianizing of the institutions of American government, which often, this is sort of how political change ends up getting made in the absence of legislation. It's unlikely that any really striking Christian nationalist legislation is going to be passed in the immediate future, given a gridlocked Congress and, kind of dysfunctional executive. But you still see the, longtime truism of Washington politics that personnel is policy. And the personnel in this administration are overwhelmingly very, very conservative Catholics or fundamentalist Christians who are using, various government departments to restrict funding to family planning providers, both here and abroad, to reinstitute funding for abstinence education, to launch attacks on the Johnson Amendment, which is the amendment that stops churches from basically turning themselves into political action committees. And so you see this, in the Justice Department, you've seen a turn away from enforcing discrimination against women and gay people and African Americans and religious minorities, and a turn towards investigating discrimination against white Christians. And so all this is happening, and in some ways it's extraordinarily strange, and that this would be happening under the administration of a president who is, among other things, the first American president that we know of to have appeared in a softcore porn film, the first American president who tried to negotiate a contract for his wife to appear nude in Playboy, the first American president to have owned a casino with a strip club in it. And so so in some ways I feel like, there was parts of Kingdom Coming that have now come to fruition, and there were parts of it that there have been developments since then that I never in a million years could have foreseen, right? When it turns out that when right-wing populist authoritarianism came to power in the United States, it wasn't, some kind of radically pious Calvinist Handmaid's Tale like theocratic movement. It was, in a lot of ways, a rebellion against all moral restraints, whose catchphrase would be "grab 'em by the pussy." And I feel like, a lot of people, I was confused by this. A lot of people have been confused by this. I spent a lot of time reporting on the Trump campaign. I was in Iowa during the caucuses when you saw a lot of the religious right mobilizing to try and stop him, mobilizing to try and get Ted Cruz in there instead. But I actually think that the relationship between Donald Trump and the religious right very quickly coalesced, as you know, coalesced behind him once he won the nomination, and has now become really the bulwark of his support. When everyone else fades away, you still have this, 35% disproportionately white conservative evangelicals who are loyal to this president. White evangelicals actually voted for Trump in higher numbers, or at least higher percentages, than they voted for George W. Bush. And you think, how can that be? There's hypocrisy there, but there's also something more. I think his movement and the Christian right have more in common than it might immediately be clear. And the beginning of that, it lies with race. One of the myths that the Christian right tells about itself is that it was born out of abhorrence to abortion and Roe v. Wade. But that's not really true, because Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973, and it took a while, many years, for the Christian right to really get rolling. And most historians of the Christian right will tell you that, not most historians, most reliable historians of the Christian right will tell you that what really drove that movement was fury when the IRS revoked the tax-exempt status of the white segregated Christian schools that had popped up in the South in reaction to Brown versus Board of Education. So they were called seg academies, segregated academies, where you could send your kids to make sure they didn't have to go to school with black people. And the IRS eventually said, that a tax-exempt school can't discriminate, and this sparked enormous outrage. And so the Christian right has always had a sort of strange, contradictory relationship with race. Its roots lie in Confederate nostalgia and, Southern identity politics. But when I was writing Kingdom Coming during the administration of George W. Bush, there was a very conscious effort to to apologize for that past, to repent that past. There was an understanding that it was embarrassing. You used to see there would be these ceremonies where white pastors would get on their knees before African American and Latino pastors and, beg forgiveness for the sin of racism. And then they would all join hands against the gays. And so, but I think what happened was that, Ralph Reed wrote about, the movement having to basically face the fact that it was on the wrong side of the civil rights struggle. What happened is that in 2008, we had a black president, and suddenly a lot of that racial reconciliation language and work went by the wayside, and the white resentment that had been key to the movement since its very beginning came roaring back to the fore. So that mapped very easily onto Donald Trump's movement. The Christian right had also, particularly in the last few decades, waged a pretty sustained battle against what might be called objective knowledge or objective truth. There was this strangely postmodern strain to the Christian right, especially when I was writing about it 11 years ago, that basically said that any reality is kind of governed or shaped by your worldview. So if you have a secular worldview, anything that flows from a secular worldview or flows from secular premises is itself questionable. So kind of science itself, if it doesn't start with the premise of God being supreme, nothing else that comes after that is reliable. And that sort of approach makes it very hard to get a hold of anything. It makes all of reality suspect. And so I compared it in my book to feeling like it was sort of like this feeling of being either in The Matrix or in a Borges novel, where you could go to a book fair and find a whole library describing a world that didn't exist, all footnoted to each other, completely self-contained, so that if you were inside of it, you would almost have no way to apprehend a reality that was outside of it. And that erosion of the reality principle in our national life has obviously set the stage for a president for whom reality is no constraint whatsoever. And then finally, there's the conspiratorial nature of the religious right. The religious right, another of its antecedents was the John Birch Society. And there has been a tremendous amount of paranoia in the movement about the quote-unquote New World Order, the Trilateral Commission, the Rockefellers, the idea, sometimes people will come out and say, Jewish financial interests, but this idea that shadowy, powerful actors are manipulating your life and undermining your sovereignty, which was key to the Trump administration, has been part of this movement since the beginning. And so when Trump came along, although in many ways, he represented a style of life that was antithetical to everything that this movement claimed to be fighting for, he also hit a lot of notes or repeated a lot of the sort of deep story of this movement. And they were able to convince themselves very quickly that he could be their, albeit imperfect, champion. And to be honest, he sort of has been. Donald Trump doesn't really keep his promises. He doesn't, he's not a loyal person, but but he does tend to like people who like him. And so he has, really tried to, I would say, obviously not remoralize American life, but he has elevated a kind of Christian identity politics so that although he himself is not kind of a pious man, he does treat white Christians as having pride of place in this country. When he says over and over again, we're going to say Merry Christmas again in this country. I mean, that's what that's about, right? It's not we're going to, celebrate the lessons of Jesus Christ. I mean, it's kind of Merry Christmas as screw you. And, I've seen, where he says, we're going to protect and take care of Christian Americans. Christian, I've heard him say that over and over again. The idea being that these people have not previously had the authority and cultural respect that they deserve. And one reason why I think the Christian right has been so quick to throw itself, not totally. There are still people who will criticize Donald Trump, leading Christian scholars and intellectuals who are part of the Never Trump movement. But the reason why the grassroots, I think, has thrown itself behind Trump, I mean, just as we've learned that a lot of the Republican Party never really cared about Paul Ryan's tax plans, I think we're learning that a lot of this movement maybe never really cared about, having a sexually chaste leader, never really cared about the moral example of the leader, as much as they cared about having their power and authority and cultural primacy recognized. And that's really what Donald Trump does. Now, and the movement also has a level of pessimism and desperation that didn't exist when I was covering it all those years ago. I mean, the movement always had a dark vision of America. And that's another reason why I think Donald Trump spoke to it. There was only two major American cultural or political figures that blamed this country for 9/11, and that was Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, who basically said, that America had been struck because it's so morally corrupt. And, when Donald Trump talks about American carnage, when he talks about this country, about the country basically going to hell, that resonates with a lot of with a lot of this movement that sees that looks around and feels like it doesn't recognize this country anymore. Nevertheless, 11 years ago, George W. Bush had been reelected. There was a sense that they were on the cusp of retaking the culture. Mega churches were growing. They felt like they were culturally ascendant. Young people were going to Patrick Henry College and then moving into the administration and moving up through the ranks of government. There was a sense that they were not in the promised land, but on the edge of the promised land, right? I mean, it's telling that one of the main groups from back then was called Generation Joshua. The ones who kind of are going to be the ones to retake the land for the chosen people. And that optimism, that kind of forward-looking momentum really disappeared during the Obama administration, which members of this movement experienced as a, profound and dislocating trauma. And so, and honestly, there was a great deal of that was just about racism, My husband, the other day we were talking, a friend of mine said, I can't imagine what it must feel like to be a sexual assault survivor and have to live with this president. And my husband said, probably how it feels to be a racist and have to live with President Obama. There was a sense in which, as much as I feel like this administration defiles the Oval Office, and in some ways it's maybe the closest I'll ever come to feeling that kind of religious sense. I mean, now I thought the other day, my God, now I know what Catholics felt like when they looked at Andre Serrano's Piss Christ, that famously controversial artwork of a crucifix submerged in urine. When I see this man sitting behind, sitting at the Resolute desk, it's, it feels unholy. That's how I think a lot of people in this movement experienced the Obama years. And part of it was just about Obama himself. Part of it was about the legalization of gay marriage, the growing cultural intolerance for intolerance, the kind of lawsuits against fundamentalist bakers and florists that refuse to cater gay weddings. So you see increasingly this sense that we're not going to take back the culture, but we need to sort of defend our borders, our metaphorical borders. This sense that the situation is so dire, they're so ready to wipe us out, that anyone who will fight on our behalf and anything that can be done on our behalf is justified, right? So this sense of extreme victimization, even stronger than anything that was there 11 years ago, I think in turn leads to an extreme aggression and kind of a permission structure to basically allow and forgive almost anything. And so anyone who's kind of been waiting for uneasiness, for the fog to break, or the fog to lift, the spell to break, I think that is extremely unlikely to happen because the movement that I wrote about in 2016, the movement I wrote about in 2006 believes that it has a biblical right to rule and experiences being displaced from the top of American society as a kind of intolerable, unbiblical, almost satanic state of affairs. And so I want to close by talking about this idea of who gets to rule, because I want to make a case to you that if you care about secularism, if you care about religious freedom, you need to care very, very deeply about voting. One of the things that's so odd about this moment of religious fundamentalist ascension in our politics is that the movement itself is shrinking, the country's becoming more secular, young people are certainly becoming more secular. positions that had a lot of power 11 years ago, like opposition to gay marriage, are increasingly minority and fringe positions. And yet people who hold these positions control everything. They control the White House. If you assume that someone besides Donald Trump is in control of most of the things the White House does. They control both branches of Congress. The majority of people in this country didn't want this. The majority of people in this country didn't vote for Donald Trump. They didn't vote for Republican senators. The majority of people hate what's going on. In 2018, the extreme likelihood is that the majority of people in this country will vote for Democrats for the House, and that might not make a difference because of both gerrymandering and just the geographic concentration of the population. Some statisticians that I've seen say that Democrats need as much as 60% of the popular vote overall to have a chance of retaking the House. And these differentials, which are both manipulated by the Republican Party through voting restrictions, through gerrymandering, but are also integral to the Constitution because of the Senate, which gives South Dakota and California the same number of senators, and the Electoral College, which gives such disproportionate power to the white, rural, conservative parts of this country, means that we are entering a period, and I feel like this is inadequately understood, at least inadequately understood maybe on our side, of flat-out minority rule. It's always been true that America was never really designed as a pure democracy, and some people would say, well, this is a republic, not a democracy. But at least since the late 1800s, popular will and electoral result has coincided. And so it was kind of possible to ignore those deeper structural questions. But of course, in 2000, for the first time in over 100 years, we got a president who had lost the popular vote. And at the time, this was treated as a fluke, that people would say, well, if this happens again, it might call the legitimacy of the whole system into question. And then 16 years later, it happened again. It might happen there are structural factors that are making this more and more likely. And so, in a way, it's not going to matter if secularists are able to spread their message or win converts or win the culture wars if they're not able to contend for political power. So again, I would just argue that, as much as you're focused on separation of church and state, your cause is the same as everyone else in this country who is fighting for a more democratic democracy and for, fighting for voting rights, fighting for more equitable forms of representation. Because, the Christian right, the Christian nationalist movement that I wrote about in this book, it's a minority of this country, but it's now the minority that's in charge. And so with that, I'll end and take any questions.
So you know where the mics are, and then our request is please ask a quick question. If you have a comment, make it a couple sentences, no speeches, or we'll have to cut you off so that more people can ask questions.
Okay. Can you comment on Trump and Russia?
That's a big question. So I would say two things. One thing that I actually, going in my second book, The Means of Reproduction, I spoke then about this growing international religious right, and at that time you saw Russia trying to make alliances with the American religious right, particularly over issues of gay rights and over international treaties around gay rights, and you started to see the nascent form of some of the alliances that have now, that now are in the White House, or at least were in the White House when Steve Bannon was there. Personally, I believe that, how should I put, I think there's no question that Russia intervened on Trump's behalf, and I strongly suspect that the more and more information that comes out, the more the kind of fundamental legitimacy of this presidency will be called into question. One reason, again, this whole dynamic a decade ago, certainly 2 decades ago, would have been hard to imagine. The idea that Russia would undermine American sovereignty and the Christian right would cheer. But it's important, again, to understand that Russia has really cultivated a lot of leaders of the American Christian right, and there are a lot of people in the American right, the American religious right, and also just the American nativist right, that far from seeing Putin as a threat, they see him as a model.
Hey, Michelle. Yesterday, another one of the speakers was asking kind of the same question: how could Christian nationalists support a man who's, a pussy-grabbing immoral, however it was? And I was wondering the same thing myself. And as a former evangelical, I started talking to some of my evangelical friends, and 2 of them actually says, "Oh, I didn't vote for Trump. I voted for Pence." Mm-hmm. And then the light went off, and I was like, well, of course. I'm a fellow New Yorker, too. We know that Trump wasn't sitting up in Trump Tower thinking, I need to put John Brennan at the CIA, I need to put Betsy DeVos in charge of education. I believe, and I'd like for you to comment on this, that he outsourced it to Pence, and Pence is the one who assembled the government. Trump doesn't know how to assemble a government. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that is absolutely true. And, and so I think what we're seeing is that, indifference can be as dangerous as fanaticism when it comes to moral issues, right? So one of the first things that Trump did was not just reinstate the global gag rule, which bars American funding to, in the past had barred American family planning funding to foreign NGOs that not just perform abortion, but that advocate for abortion law liberalization, that counsel people about abortion. So it was inevitable that any Republican president was going to reinstate this, right? Ronald Reagan promulgated it in 1980, and it's just kind of gone back and forth with Republicans and Democrats ever since. When Republicans are in power, they put it into effect, Democrats undo it. Trump did something different. And I think that this was entirely Pence's handiwork. He massively expanded the global gag rule. So in the past, the global gag rule bound American family planning funding. It didn't bar all American health aid, which is a much larger pool of money. And there was a reason for that. Again, I don't want to retrospectively minimize the badness of George W. Bush's presidency. But George W. Bush would have never done something like this because it would have, as the head of PEPFAR, the president's AIDS program, told me, it would have fatally undermined that program. You couldn't have had an effective AIDS prevention program of the kind you had under George W. Bush if you had this provision in place that would basically require you to audit every single clinic or every single organization that's been charged with giving out antiretrovirals or doing AIDS tests. But, Donald Trump doesn't care if the AIDS program works. And so he's willing to give a much freer hand to Pence and the people that he surrounded themselves with because he feels, because he doesn't really feel beholden to effective policy outcomes. And so, again, what's it to him if 17 times as much money is suddenly brought under the purview of this really restrictive policy?
Hi. I find a lot of the insights extremely interesting, and from your comment about like a blind man trying to feel an elephant. But I guess the question I have is, where is economics, capitalism, the way we run our relationships among people in commerce and so forth, where is that in all this? Because I don't think a lot of these things just come down to racism and homophobia. I think those are symptoms of a lot of that, but I also think there is a large piece of all of this that has to do with our economic relations, and I'd like you to know your opinions on that.
So I think that we're going to be debating the precise balance between quote-unquote economic anxiety and xenophobia and nationalism and sexism and all these other factors. The way that these things interacted in this, catastrophic election, I think we'll be debating that forever. Maybe in 500 years hence, when there's a symposium on what happened to America, people will be arguing about those things. My personal sense is that, Donald Trump won white people at every income level, and people who, I don't have the statistic in front of me, so I could be wrong. My understanding is that people who said that the economy was the most important issue to them, although, correct me if I'm wrong, voted for Hillary Clinton, and that the most, the kind of predictive factor on whether you voted for Trump was above all your views on race, gender, and immigration. But at the same time, I think, just as to completely violate Godwin's law, it would be ridiculous to talk about the rise of Nazism without reference to anti-Semitism and bigotry and hatred, but it wouldn't have arisen as it did without, economic collapse and hyperinflation. And so, when people feel insecure and desperate, and they look around and their kids' lives are failing and their communities seem like kind of ugly and stagnant, then of course they're going to be more susceptible to really pessimistic, apocalyptic, millenarian ideologies. So I don't think you can simply say that Trump is a response to kind of bad trade deals or the decline of manufacturing. And one of the reasons that I think that we now see that is you certainly haven't seen Trump's movement abandon him as he has filled his cabinet with appointees from Goldman Sachs. But I do think that, a country that is as unequal as ours, as precarious as ours, where people feel that their day-to-day lives are, getting worse and worse, of course, that opens space for demagogues. And so going forward, there's not really a choice or an opposition between fighting for more fair and decent economic policies and fighting these kind of soft, so-called cultural battles.
Yes, here in Wisconsin, Trump won with a sliver, 10 to 15,000 votes. I would estimate there's hundreds of thousands of Wisconsinites with failure to vote remorse. And I think a couple factors which I think weighed in heavily here is the decades-long successful vilification of Hillary Clinton. And on top of that, more recently, we have the effect of predictive polling, which overwhelmingly, for many, many months, predicted her win. And I think that's had a huge effect. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that we are never going to, especially when the margins are so very, very thin, we're never going to be able to say exactly what made such a, relatively small group of people stay home. I do know, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in Wisconsin, your new voter ID laws, or that there was, I believe, 200,000 people in Wisconsin who lacked the requisite voter ID? 300. Okay. So, so I think that's probably part of it. The demonization of Hillary Clinton is probably part of it. Russian misinformation is probably part of it. We still don't know. You know, there was a story in the New York Times earlier this month saying that, you know, the Russians had the capabilities they couldn't change vote totals, but they did have access to the voter rolls. We still don't know if they went in and deleted people from the voter rolls. The forensics that would let you do that would let you look into that, just there's nobody who's kind of undertaking that work. And so, you know, people will also criticize Hillary Clinton's strategy in various states. You know, why didn't she visit Wisconsin? But she lost, you know, by about the same number of votes in Pennsylvania, where she spent a ton of time. So in some ways, this was sort of like a black swan event where all sorts of contingencies had to trigger at the same time in order for this catastrophic result that happened despite the will of most of the people in this country. I think my warning, though, is that we shouldn't think of this as a one-time thing. I think this could, given both voting laws and the population distribution in this country, it could happen again.
Could you comment on the national popular vote movement that's designed to work around the Electoral College without a constitutional amendment?
So to be honest, I don't understand whether. I think it's like a really promising movement, and right now it's the only way to take this on, because you're never going to get the requisite number of states or the requisite number of senators to vote for a constitutional amendment, right? I mean, in a way, this is kind of shows where we are. It doesn't matter if the majority of people don't like this system. The majority of people cannot change it. And so that is like the workaround. It's the one way that you could get rid of this antiquated structure that a lot of people want to get rid of but can't through this basic interstate compact. But I've seen multiple perspectives on whether it would hold up, basically, and I just don't know. I mean, I just don't know the kind of legal questions and, you know, whether it would. Whether that agreement would hold up in the face of a kind of a challenge from the other side. Okay.
I thank you very much for a very reasoned discussion, and it's kind of to the point of my question. We know that a lot of the voters that came out for Mr. Trump did so contrary almost to the reason in terms of the likely benefit to their own personal situations and so forth. And certainly a lot of the arguments presented were not based on reason and were factually incorrect. We also saw that as a result of the conflict between two very strong groups in the Democratic primaries between the Bernie and Hillary people, that once Hillary got the nomination, that Bernie-leaning people who were very progressive, extremely progressive in their viewpoints, shied away from supporting Hillary to a significant enough extent that they clearly, their absence was part of what contributed to the direction of the election. So how do you appeal to people that are so capable of ignoring reason when it comes down to the final, almost existential exercise of reason in order to prevail?
Well, I think that you're talking about two different groups of people there, right? I mean, people often talk about people who vote against their economic self-interest, but economic self-interest is not the only kind of interest that exists. And I think a lot of people think that there are other sorts of priorities, right? I mean, I vote against my economic self-interest pretty much every single election, you know? I mean, the fact is, if Trump has his way, he's going to give my family a big tax cut that we don't want. And so, So I think that, the people who voted, I think that a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump were, some of them thought that they were going to get their factories back and get their jobs back, and some of them thought that that pales in comparison to a country in which white Christians are esteemed and respected, and, the rest of these people who are harping about discrimination will, once again, understand their place. Then there's like another question about why the left can't be united, and, this kind of perpetual talk about the lesser, not wanting to vote for the lesser of two evils, the eternal appeal of third parties. And this seems like something that every generation has to learn for itself, there was like a whole generation of people that voted for Ralph Nader and will never vote for a third party again. And, I think that's happened. I think that's probably happened again. We'll see. And then, it'll only, wait till, 2040 when somebody's trying to explain why, Sherrod Brown and Alex Jones are just two sides of the same coin. But thank you so much.